Hello, everybody. This is Jim Hogue at the house at Pooh Corner. After, 30-some years of being at the house at Pooh Corner, here we are again. And our guest today is Richard C. Cook, who has written a new book. And I read his first book about 10 years ago. And I think we met in California. And I believe we had a chat in the bar at the hotel, but I'm not sure about that. It was a long time ago. And Richard's new book is called Our Country Then and Now. And the title, by the way, reminds me of one of David Ray Griffin's last book, which was The American Trajectory, Divine or Demonic. And I think we're going to be hitting on such themes today. I don't know. That's totally up to Mr. Cook. So I will let Richard Cook tell you about his book and whatever he wants to mention. We met on the subject of monetary reform at a conference, and he is an expert on monetary matters. But here we will talk about our country then and now. So, Mr. Cook, go for it.
Hey, thank you, Jim. And hello, everybody. This is the book that Jim has mentioned, Our Country Then and Now. And there's two pictures on the cover. The one on the top is the colonial capital in Williamsburg, Virginia. That happens to be where I went to high school and college. My mom was a historian and interpreter for colonial Williamsburg, and the significance of the colonial capital is this is where the motion for American independence was introduced to the Virginia Convention in 1776. They carried the message to Philadelphia, where the motion was entered on the floor of the Continental Congress by the lead Virginia representatives, and this turned into the Declaration of Independence written by another Virginia member of the Continental Congress, of course, Thomas Jefferson, who happened to also go to William and Mary, where I went to. So I have pretty strong links to this part of history. And of course, the second picture is the U.S. Capitol during the second impeachment of Donald Trump, which took place, of course, in the end of his first term, 2021. And you can see there the armed guards back in the picture, the barbed wire. So it's quite a transition going from the stately Capitol in colonial Williamsburg to the barbed wire around our Capitol a little over 200 years later. So one might be tempted to ask, looking at this cover of my book, what happened? How did we go from the one to the other? And that's a question that I try to answer in my book. This is actually my third major book of American history. The first one I wrote about the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, because when Challenger blew up in 1986, I found myself a whistleblower for turning over the O-ring papers to the New York Times and ending up on the witness stand of the Presidential Commission, where I tried to explain that NASA had known for years that something like this could happen. I never went back to my job at NASA after my testimony. Instead, I was fortunate to land at the U.S. Treasury Department, where I then worked for 21 years. And working for the U.S. Treasury Department, which brought me in close contact with the Federal Reserve System, I tried to figure out how the monetary system of the United States had become such a mess. And I think I did figure it out. I ended up writing a book about that, and that's the book that you referred to, Jim. We Hold These Truths, The Hope of Monetary Reform. And I also ended up working with the American Monetary Institute, and the head of that was a man named Steve Zarlenga, who wrote a fantastic book called The Lost Science of Money. Many of your listeners may be familiar with. tracing the history of money and how the travesty of fractional reserve banking that we're now plagued by came into existence. And so I worked with Steve on that. We wrote together a piece of model legislation to change the monetary system in the United States, which we call the American Monetary Act. And then we ran into Dennis Kucinich, who was a congressman at that time from Ohio. Dennis became interested in monetary reform, and actually part of my book is an all-day briefing I gave to Dennis at an apartment of a friend on Capitol Hill in Washington. Dennis translated it into the Need Act of 2011, which replaces the Federal Reserve System, abolishes the Federal Reserve System, and replaces it with genuine indigenous American currency. After that legislation was put into the hopper in Congress, Dennis was gerrymandered out of his congressional seat and has never returned to public office since then. But his legislation stays on the books. And the appendix to my book explains how the NEED Act, NEED, would change the entire monetary system of the United States, and thereby it would change the entire monetary system of the world. And so that's all referred to and explained in an appendix to my book. And you can find this, of course, on all of the major sites, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and so on, or through my publisher, Clarity Press. And I would encourage your listeners to at least go on to one of these sites and take a look at the description of the book and see if you might have an interest in it. It's a history of the United States, but the focus is on monetary affairs. Even though I interweave through this my own family history, my first American ancestors came to this country as part of the great Puritan migration in the 1630s to Massachusetts, and gradually worked their way westward, ending up in Montana, where I was born, in 1946, in a place that was steeped in Native American history. Excuse me, I had to push my alarm button off. And so included in my book is also a parallel history of Native Americans. I have some Native American ancestry through my French-Canadian grandfather. And growing up in Montana and going back there several times for the writing of this book, the indigenous history of the United States, which of course developed apart from the monetary system based on fractional reserve banking, is a very inspiring, important part of what people can do and the kind of lives they can build without having the tremendous weight of bank debt hanging over them with everything they do, which is what the situation is with our country today, including the $37 trillion debt that now afflicts the United States government. And of course, we're now looking at President-elect Donald Trump pleading with Congress to once more raise the debt ceiling so we can borrow even more trillions of dollars just to keep the doors open of the federal government, which is a cosmic level of absurdity that has never been truly explicated. There have been a few reformers, people like Ron Paul. Now, Thomas Massie has proposed abolishing the Federal Reserve, although he doesn't explain what to replace it with. So he also should read my book. Mm-hmm. But what I try to focus on this, and I'm looking at some notes I made the last couple of days, Jim, preparing for this interview. And what I wrote down was, for almost 200 years, starting with the settlement of America, where my ancestors were and many other people's ancestors, the Americans built a prosperous economy without a single bank.
Yep.
All through the 1600s, through most of the 1700s. I mean, think about that. Today, money comes from the bank. It comes from people borrowing. It comes from companies borrowing. It comes from the government borrowing. And then when the bank issues the loan, that becomes money in circulation. But it always has a string attached to it. It always has to go to the bank. And not only does it have to go back to the bank, but it has to go back collecting compound interest, which is a process known by the very elegant term usury. Now, usury, or the extraction of interest on loans, was outlawed by the Catholic Church in Europe for 1,000 years. That prohibition was lifted around the year 1500, and it was lifted because banking then began to move in to take control of the economies of the Western world, and that banking system gradually grew, and it migrated across Europe from Italy, southern Germany, to Amsterdam, which became one of the key banking centers of the Renaissance period. And then it became the Bank of England. And from the Bank of England, it jumped across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States after the U.S. Constitution was written, and after the U.S. Constitution failed to provide an indigenous monetary system for the new United States government. And I have a chapter in my book called Constitutional Confusion, which explains how and why that failure took place. Now, to go back to the earlier period, there was plenty of money in the colonial economies. It included Indian wampum, which was traded freely among the Indians and among the European colonies. Spanish gold dollars were a big source of currency. But the main forms of currency were bills of credit issued by colonial governments based upon commodities, such as corn was a big one that was monetized. Lumber was monetized because lumber was a major export to Europe. Tobacco in Virginia. When you took your tobacco into a state-operated warehouse, you got a paper receipt, and that circulated as currency in Virginia. And in Pennsylvania and other colonies, they set up what they called land banks, where a landowner could go in, mortgage his land to the land bank, receive bills of credit or paper money, cash certificates in return, and then that would circulate throughout the entire colonial economy. Now, what brought on the American Revolution? Most specifically, and this is not understood, it's not taught, it was the Currency Act of 1767, where the British Parliament, losing control over the economic affairs of the colonies, outlawed the issuance of paper notes or bills of credit by the colonial legislatures. This immediately created a depression throughout the colonies in the New World. And when you added onto that the new taxes imposed by the Parliament, particularly the Stamp Act that we're all familiar with, it created a situation where the colonists knew they were falling into a state of monetary slavery to the British Parliament. And the British Parliament was controlled at that time and ever since by the moneylenders, specifically by the Bank of England, which was a privately owned institution run by the biggest bankers, the biggest moneylenders, the biggest usurers in the world. And the Bank of England has continued its preeminence in the field of usury and monetary totalitarianism to this day. The City of London, that 1 square mile, where the Rothschilds have their central bank and the Barings Bank and the other big bankers, that's the heart of tyranny and usury in the world today. And when you translate that into military affairs, into economic affairs, into everything that we're seeing today, that is the root and the source of the entire world crisis today. And this is what I try to explain in my book. Because once Alexander Hamilton went up to George Washington, Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury, and said, we need a bank like the Bank of England to run the economy of our country. That was the beginning of the takeover of the United States by an alien force. And this alien force was fractional reserve banking based on usury being lending at compound interest, coming out of Europe, extending its tentacles across the Atlantic Ocean, and taking over the affairs of the United States. So,
Okay, I've got, before we, can you hear me okay?
Yep, very
All
good.
right. Before we drown everyone in this wonderful information, which, by the way, as a monetary reformer myself, I can confirm is all true. The very last thing you said is still up for great debate about Hamilton. And I was always I said exactly what you've said. Then Ellen Brown wrote a piece about 6 months ago explaining the trick that Hamilton played on the European banks, which was that, yes, they would become creditors, but they would never get any interest, or that they would never get it paid back, and they would never vote. So they weren't part of the bank. And so Hamilton had a kind of an interesting backdoor. I can't explain it. I don't remember all the details of Ellen's article, but
Can I just tell you why that's not
sure.
true?
Sure.
It's not, yeah, they did set up certain safeguards to keep the European bankers, and it was the European bankers, particularly the Dutch bankers at that time, who financed the first Bank of the United States, and then later the second Bank of the United States, although by then you had some indigenous financiers, mainly out of Philadelphia. They didn't even buy the stock in the bank. They wrote paper IOUs. And these became the basis for lending by the first Bank of the United States. But the way it worked was, and Hamilton knew this, the growth of the bank and the operations of the bank would gradually lead to appreciation in the value of those IOUs they used to buy it originally. That was where the profit was going to come in. And that was recognized and criticized by the backers and followers of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Monroe, who became the core of what was then called the Democratic Republican Party. It was the appreciation in the value of the IOUs that was to be the payoff for the big investors, and everybody knew it. And I wrote it in my book. So that's my answer to that. Because Hamilton was trying to avoid the appearance of profiteering by the bankers, and that's how he did it. But he always had in mind the idea of the appreciation of bank stock. Can I read this famous quote of Thomas Jefferson
on that subject?
On the setting up the banking system?
Yes, go ahead. I wonder if I've used it. I've written a lot about banking, and I wonder, I'm curious to hear the quote because I may have used it myself. Go ahead.
It's a very familiar quote that a lot of people have heard, but it's so much to the point that I think it's something, I included it in my book. So Jefferson wrote, I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Already they have raised up a money aristocracy that has set the government at defiance. And he was absolutely right.
Yep.
This issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. If the and that was what was done by the Lincoln government during the Greenback era,
Yes.
but which I also cover extensively in the book. Jefferson continued, if the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered.
Yes.
So prophetic. And that's
Yes.
exactly what has happened today, not only to the Americans on the continent that our fathers conquered, but every other country in the world. Every other country in the world, with some now breaking away, have been subject to exactly the same dynamic, because what fractional reserve banking does and what usury does is it gradually accumulates all the surplus wealth of the world economy into the hands of the bankers.
Yep.
And into the hands of the billionaires who are the next level down from the bankers. And a very large proportion of money created out of thin air by the banks, by the central banks and all of the little banks under them, is not money for production. It's money for speculation. The amount of money that is used, a big example is leveraged buyouts. What is a leveraged buyout? It's where somebody borrows billions of dollars from the bank to buy a corporation, to strip it of its assets, to fire most of its employees, and then to drive it into bankruptcy. If you look around, they may want to ask, where is Toys R Us? Toys R Us, we all went shopping for our kids there at Christmas time. Where is it? It was destroyed. It was destroyed by leveraged buyouts that loaded so much debt on the company that it just dissolved and went into receivership. And this has happened over and over and over again, not just in America, but throughout the entire world. And this is what is causing a world of endless war. This is what is causing nations to be destroyed. It's all because the wealth of the world is sucked into the hands of the banking system and into the hands of the billionaires who preside over it. So anyway, that's
Well, I would like to agree with that and add the great book by the 5,000 Years of Debt. That's not the exact title, but you know the book I'm talking about. That the First 5,000 Years is the name of the book. And he explains exactly what you did. And then he gives examples of how that money doesn't go to build canals. It doesn't go to build roads. It doesn't go to help people. It stacks up to fight wars and to build whatever is not conducive to the public good. It's not money that is collected in a way of a public spirit. And it could, Eisenstein, is that his name, who wrote that, the first 5,000 years? Yeah. And I wrote a paper called Battle Over Banking, in which I use the Jefferson quote that you read, and I use a long quote by him explaining where that money goes and why it is so detrimental to the world at large. It's not just detrimental to some town, which it is, but it's also detrimental to the world because it's exploitive. So I agree with you completely. The word we used for the colonial money was colonial scrip.
right.
Yeah, that kind of covers what they did. And I did several interviews. You mentioned that you saw my interview with Kiriakou. I also did several interviews with people about the formation of money, monetary issues in the colonies,
Right.
and how colonial scrip was the engine that helped drive all of this. And that, I have a date question for you. There were two currency acts, right? 1764 and 1767?
The big one was 1767. That's the one I'm.
Okay, yeah, and that's the one that curtailed monetary growth or production
Right.
in the colonies. And contrary to what you all learned in your history books, it wasn't the Stamp Act that did the big damage. That was visible because you had to pay a tax for the stamp. So it's easy to teach that. It's easy to teach your students that, oh, this was terrible because, you know, you had to pay this money for a stamp. But the damage was done with the Currency Act.
Right.
And yeah, and every time I read something in a normal, you know, publication, they blame the Stamp Act.
Right.
And then I might write a letter to the editor, I might do something, and say, no, it was the Currency Act that did the damage.
Right.
And the Hamilton, yes, it's a very interesting and confusing story about Hamilton. It kept getting worse. I mean, after the Civil War, well, it was the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 that did more damage than anything else. But you're right, Hamilton kind of set up the idea that this could be done. And I think he had to do it, from what I read from Ellen Brown and others. He had to do that because there was literally no money and a great deal of debt to the French, I believe also to the Russians, because they helped in the War of Independence. And so he figured out a way to keep the money flowing in the colonies, but also satisfy the people to whom the colonies owed this tremendous debt. Does that make sense? Do you agree with that?
I think no, it doesn't, because I think he did have a choice. He could have done what they did during the Revolution, which was to print the continental currency and use that to pay debts. Now, of course, the knock on continental currency was it inflated. But the main reason it inflated was because the British were printing counterfeit notes.
Okay, we've only got 10 seconds left for this first half hour, but we can pick up on this.
Yeah, no, I don't cut any slack for Alexander Hamilton.
No, I never did either. I said he was. I used to say he was the greatest traitor that we ever had. But anyway, okay, thank you.
Okay.
So I don't know if we're still on, but if we're still on, thanks for listening, everybody, and we will be doing part 2.